I want to make sure you know that this is not going to be a lecture. I'm going to be hosting this as a conversation, and I will be asking questions throughout, not only to hear your thoughts and be able to give your voice a chance, but also as a model of what you can do if you want to turn around and use this with your students or anybody else. So our goals for today are to explore, analyze how artists capture, visualize, and communicate data in their work. I'm going to start you off with a question. If a picture's worth 1,000 words, what data have you visualized? Anybody want to put in the chat any kind of data that you may have visualized, even if it's just in the form of numbers or a collection that you have? Thinking about that, I'll forewarn you that each of the artists and artworks we're about to explore are going to help you redefine data and how to utilize it. So as you're putting things in the chat box, I'm going to let you know that I've organized this workshop around 3 main ideas. The first one is capture. What data inspired the artists? And it's going to be divided into frequency of occurrence, nature-driven, and mapping. We're going to look at the media, the material that the artist has used to give form to the data, and what is it communicating? How do you interpret the data and media components working together? What messages are being conveyed? So just on that alone, you can probably realize we're going to be covering a lot of material in a very short period of time. So let's take a look at, it's not an artwork, but you probably recognize this as a chart that's used when you go and get your vision checked. You notice how it's organized, that the letters decrease in size from top to bottom. And compare that to this example done by Luc Dubois. He was commissioned for the 2008 Democratic National Convention to do something based on the presidency. He captured data from the American Presidency Project at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and he took the State of the Union addresses from each presidency and sorted them according to word frequency. He called the series Hindsight is Always 2020. The artist chose the eye chart, creating one for each president, and printed the most frequently appearing words in larger type at the top and the less frequently used words toward the bottom. The traditional eye chart includes 66 letters. Dubois charts substitute 66 words. So for the sake of your time and eyes, I'm going to ask you to compare just the most frequently said words of what started off with George Washington in this example to 3 more presidents. And even without telling you their names, what do their words communicate about the most important issues on their minds? Any first reactions? And you're welcome to unmute or to write in the chat box.
Not sure if you can see the chat, Peg, but Renee has shared power.
And is that true? Does she think for all 4 presidents? Renee, if you want to elaborate a little. And as you're thinking,
she says yes in the chat for true for all 4.
Yes. Okay.
And Emma's noting also it's really interesting to see how it seems to get more intense over time in looking at the 4. Kara's noting a sense of urgency. AY is noting money, fear, enemy. Someone else, Marina is noting state of affairs, notably war. Emma is seeing gentlemen, limits, bank, and terror, those 4 top words, the largest words that pop out. And Kateri is just really linking those to current concerns at the time that these were written. Angel's linking it to emotions that they want to transmit to the public.
Thank you, everybody. So what's interesting is how many of those things that you're noticing are still issues that we're dealing with today. Even though you're looking at the first one on the top left from George Washington, on the top right, you've got Thomas Jefferson, bottom left is Andrew Jackson, and George W. Bush on the bottom right, who actually ends the series. In doing this, Dubois was trying to show how words reflect the issues and ideals addressed by each president, and also give an impression of how the language was used at that time. I'm going to play you a short video of him standing in front of his work. Listen to what he has to say about it. It's just a very short introduction.
Really great kind of snapshot of the progression of political rhetoric. Okay, so you start out way down there with George Washington. You have gentlemen, right? And then you end up with our current president. You have terror. So you got from gentleman to terror in sort of 43 easy steps. And as it kind of goes through, you can see all the sort of topics that were on kind of the nation's mind at the time. So right behind you, when you've got the 1840s and 50s, you got the whole slavery debate. Right behind here, when you've got the late 19th century, you've got all the Industrial Revolution. So you've got words like corporations and procedure and processes. This is the Cold War right in front of you. And you can see things like the intrusion of media, right? So Lyndon Johnson's #1 word is tonight. And the only reason for that is he had to give the first speech on primetime television. So speechwriters had to begin every word with a paragraph with the word tonight.
So think about it, because the president was giving the first televised speech, he was told to use the word tonight more frequently, whether it had anything to do with those words or not. And take a look at the quote below. This project was envisioned as a way to emphasize the State of the Union address as a significant aspect of the power relationship between the executive and legislative branches of the US government, as well as comment on the metaphor of vision in evaluating leadership throughout history. If you're an educator, any thoughts on how you might use this project with your students, whether the format of the eye chart or dealing with presidents and their speeches and their leadership? And while you're writing in the chat box, I'll let you know that we've got additional examples of different artworks that I'll be putting in a resource at the end of this PowerPoint. We won't have time to show them all, but you'll have that if you ask for the PowerPoint.
And Peg Renee is sharing in the chat, I like a discussion of historical context, and also sharing how power comes across in the use of the words gentlemen, limits, terror, money, and payment. Back to your earlier question. And also AY is sharing it. You could ask students to convey their daily lives through words or headlines.
Definitely make it something that's really applicable to them today. They understand the power of what they're saying. Any other thoughts, Carol?
Amanda shared, at first the words seem reflective of the event, and I'm left wondering what would emerge with a closer look. So wondering, how you digging into those smaller words and really digging into what those words convey. How would that bear fruit with a closer look?
Yeah, that's a great idea for how to be able to utilize these for a deeper look, because just for the sake of the fact that you're looking at them on a screen, and also for the sake of the time for the workshop, we're not digging deeper, but definitely Why would that word be the one that stands out the most? And why would the ones that are less used be further down the list?
Yes, and Angel's sharing, looking at the parts of their speeches and the purposes of each part in connection to the amount of words and the amount of times those words are repeated. And looking at the time, the historical context they gave the speeches in, maybe students could do an exercise to replace certain words with others and how that would affect the speech.
That's a great idea. And even take it a little further, maybe leave some blank and see what people might put in it to make that speech more powerful.
Yes, Kateri is sharing, as a museum docent, I'd ask for which important words first describe what they see in the art and why. And also someone else sharing, I like the Dubois words seem so, quote, reserved, and yet they're packed with power and emotion.
Ooh.
And also we've got a hand up. Melvin, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, just very quickly, it seems that the technology in both the Google platform and the Teams platform allows students using the software to actually do these word clouds. So I think there's some techniques that we could use to kind of lift this kind of approach to that implicates all kinds of learning opportunities for students, both visual and language arts as well.
Definitely, and as more software is created since this project was done, such as the word cloud, definitely bring it up to date with that. Thanks for that idea. All right, this is also just a reminder that if you're not speaking, please make sure to mute your mic. That'll enable us to hear everybody a lot better. All right, so that was what we called frequency of occurrence. We're now going to shift to nature driven. And it may be a little hard to see the details of the map on the right. So let me explain that Janet Eckelman, who you see on the left, was inspired by this graphic. It's a map of the energy released across the Pacific Ocean during the earthquake and tsunami on March 11th, 2011. The graphic was created by NOAA's Center for Tsunami Research and shows the maximum wave heights in centimeters. So now that data has been captured in a two-dimensional format, how might you communicate that as a three-dimensional sculpture? Well, first of all, consider scale. Would you make a model that could fit on a table or one that could take over a gallery? Which would better communicate an event that spread across the whole Pacific Ocean? Janet Eckelman was commissioned by our museum to create a work for Renwick's 4,000 square foot gallery. She titled it 1.8 Renwick. And 1.8 refers to the fact that the 2011 earthquake was so powerful that it shifted the Earth on its axis and shortened the day by 1.8 millionths of a second. Renwick refers to Sam's second museum building, which is located near the White House. Imagine that you're walking into this gallery, and how might you experience this work? In person generated a very unique museum experience. Spotlights made the suspended form glow. It's not solid like the tsunami, but yet it still occupies and defines space. And the patterns in the rug, which was also designed by Eckelman, reflected topographical information about the sea floor. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here. I'm going to ask you if it's to think about other types of artwork in a different way. Would you be conscious of experiencing different ways to mark time if you were sharing Eckelman's fascination with the measurement of time as captured by the data that inspired it, as reflected in the artwork's title, as it reflected to how much time you might spend with this in the gallery? Or maybe you'd think about time when you learn it took approximately 500,000 individual knots on triple braided polyethylene that's 15 times stronger than steel, which was originally developed for NASA spacesuits and in total covers over 15 miles? Or how about the time it would take just to install this artwork? And then think how much time we're doing right now to understand it and figure out how you might use it in your curriculum. If visitors didn't read the labels, which included the NOAA graphic, they didn't realize that it's based upon a natural disaster. With or without this knowledge, a surprise to the museum staff was a large number of visitors who laid right down on the rug to watch the colors change. So this raises the question about what prior knowledge and experience is important to have before experiencing an artwork. Let me give you just a little bit of an example. There's no sound with this. So what do you think? If you didn't know the title, if you didn't know what it was based on, would your experience of this piece be different?
Someone sharing in the chat, Peg, it looks really majestic, but also really imposing and threatening, which I guess makes sense given what the subject or the data is about, the tsunami for sure. Someone else noting the beauty of nature, yet reality of nature is also conveyed. Someone's noting that might guidance by the artist or the intellectual prowess that resides in the curatorial community be helpful in helping us understand our engagement with the work. So question about sort of how we interpret the work in the gallery to help us engage. And really following up on that, sharing how the power of the artist to take historical content, interpret it, and that helps us navigate the future. Renee also sharing the prior knowledge takes the installation from aesthetically beautiful to also intellectually moving. So, if you don't know the context, you experience it one way on an aesthetic level, but it's, added the intellectual content to it also makes it moving. Someone sharing its beauty like a sunset, but knowing it represents a tsunami, I wouldn't want to lay beneath it.
This is great. You're really picking up on how an artwork can within itself embody completely different contrasts in terms of knowledge, in terms of your emotional and physical reaction to it, and also whether it motivates you to want to learn more about it. What is this artist trying to communicate? And that leads me right to my next step with this. And I want you to ask yourself how you would sense the power of this geological event. Would you sense it, as some of you have kind of referred to? Yes or no in the chat box. Carol, let's just see how many people get that sense that this is some powerful event.
Can you just repeat the question, Peg, so they're clear what they're answering?
Yep, I'm going to repeat it a little bit differently way. If you hadn't seen the NOAA graphic when you walked into this gallery, would you still sense the power of this event? In other words, can the artwork on its own create a sense of power that you are feeling, that you are interpreting from it? Yes or no?
So a lot of folks are saying yes. It seems like really almost everybody's saying yes. Thinking about the size and the colors, the sheer largeness of the size, the warm colors communicating power. Someone else sharing that, it has a sense of power, but not in the scary sense, if you didn't know the context. Someone else sharing it looks powerful like nature often can, but even if you don't know the specifics. Someone sharing the colors again, red, orange, yellow, really representing energy. to me. So that idea of energy, you know, and putting color theory to work here in interpreting energy and power. One person sharing not sure, but a lot of folks are sharing yes.
That is great. I love the way you're picking up also on the color, which we haven't really discussed. And even though we had no idea exactly why all those people were laying down on the rug, and as you saw, there was a large majority that did so, I often think when you're asked to tilt your head to look up at something, and you have to think about your own balance, to almost encompass and take in this whole work, maybe it literally flattens you. Maybe you literally need to lay down on your back in order to be able to absorb it and take it all in.
Yeah,
So
it seems that you're almost overwhelmed by it, and some others sharing, capturing wave and movement, and the shape feels overwhelming, as if we're going to embrace you.
mhm. So let's take this another step. Eckelmann is really after trying to reflect complex interconnections between human beings and our physical world. She's looking at how forces that are contrasted, as you've picked up on, how we can understand and control those and ones we cannot, and which ones concern our daily existence with larger cycles of time. Let's look at a quote from her. As individuals, we may feel fragile like a length of thread, but when knotted together, we have the capacity for incredible strength and resiliency. So it makes you wonder how many people are looking at this and the individual pieces of it and reading it as a whole. For each new work, Eckelmann consults with a cadre of architects, aeronautical engineers, lighting designers, and computer programmers throughout the world. I don't have a deep knowledge of all these disciplines, but I consider myself a collaborator. I have an idea, a vision, and we work together to realize it. So a whole nother way of looking at this piece is how many people did it take to make it? What research did she have to do to know what kind of media she wanted to use, and then how to be able to manipulate it? Any thoughts more about this piece? All right, I'm going to move on.
Yeah, someone, as you're doing that, Peg, someone just shared directly with me that the art really conveys the emotion more so than a set of numbers or a set of scientific data. It really conveys the sense of fragility in terms of what it's made of, but also in terms of how overwhelmed we feel by it. That just those just numbers in a data set may not convey. So that was interesting.
Mm-hmm. And now you're getting the idea of as to why I started off with the hindsight is 2020, because coming to this workshop, I thought you might define data, first of all, as a set of numbers. And now, as I promised, we're going to totally expand your whole definition of data. So let's go on to another nature-driven example. Before I tell you the title of this artwork, let me ask you, can clouds make music? And if yes, what would it sound like? Anybody want to use their imagination? To make music, what would it sound like?
So we're hearing things like thunder, piano keys, drums. Maybe it would sound relaxing and soothing.
Aha, very different reactions and thoughts and examples. So let's take a closer look at this installation, at the media you see here, while I tell you more about this artwork. When the artist Robert Watts, a former Navy engineer, moved to New York City in the 1950s to pursue art, he felt trapped. The Iowa native, who spent the days and nights of his childhood gazing at the open sky, felt dwarfed by the city's skyscrapers and blinding lights. In his new city, he couldn't see the sky, but started to think perhaps he could help people hear it. So along with the video engineer Bob Diamond, who was a former NASA analyst, and composer David Bierman, an experimental musician, Watts created a video system that analyzes 6 points in the sky. The project was conceived pre-computer in the 1970s. Watts and Berman built their system from scratch, wiring 6 crosshairs on the camera to a mechanism that then interprets the data and sends it to a synthesizer programmed with pre-selected 4-part chords played through speakers. The speakers, staggered across the walls, correspond with the 6 video points in the monitors and on the camera's viewfinder. So you're listening to video and watching sound composed in real time. I'm going to say that again, listening to video and watching sound composed in real time. It's titled Cloud Music. The system is weather dependent. Changes in the atmosphere like storms, high pressure, or the occasional flock of birds will energize the score, making the tempo or tones change more quickly. I'm going to play you an excerpt, and as you listen, how would you describe the sound? And would you say it's music? And we're going to listen to just a little bit. You may want to be ready to turn your volume down. So do we have a consensus of opinion? Do you think it sounded like music?
So we have 1 yes, it sounded like music, 2 yeses. A couple of people are noticing synesthesia and sort of the connection between asking us to be synesthetes. You're asking us to mine creativity, and this should be the role of educators for students. Someone else mentioning as well, synestheus. Someone mentioning sounds like technology or a synthesizer. Someone else mentioning it sounds like Pink Floyd. Or an organ key, like maybe if you hold down an organ key. Someone noting it sounds like music, but not a song. And someone else noticing using the word cacophony. Someone else talking about how do you define music in the modern era? Really, he's saying, yes, it did sound like music and liked it very much. Someone else sharing that the interpretation seems dependent on the tone the artist chooses to represent the conditions in which change the tone, when the sensors encounter something in the sky. So that is interesting. The artist is still having control in some sense in what sounds are being played. Someone else wondering, what does it sound like on a stormy day versus a calm day? Really interesting question.
So there's a number of things there that everybody has shared, which are great as different ways of looking at this work and thinking about it. And that is what choice an artist makes of the media that they choose is definitely going to have an influence on how you, the viewer or listener, interpret that piece. You started talking about color with Janet Eckelman. You're now talking about the artist having a prior choice of tones, but how much of it is also left up to chance? And how much of it is something that is dependent upon your prior knowledge and experiences? It might be hard to even think about this as music because it isn't relying on the scales that you typically find in Western music. If we had time, I'd go back to my first question. Can clouds make music? Something to think about. This is a completely different piece. You may notice some loose threads. You may notice that it's made out of cloth. What other words might you use to describe this quilt? And does it look like anything familiar? We've got a little bit of a clue in the top left-hand corner there.
So we're seeing words like maps, city blocks, landscape, city, a grid or a map, an abstract map, perhaps.
Great.
Someone mentioning property lines.
Ah.
Someone else mentioning looks like an overhead map, or possibly might be depicting expansion. So people getting, I think, feel like people are getting a sense of sort of a topography here.
Mhm. Great. I wonder if I hadn't had the word mapping up there, what you would think. But it was a great way to introduce this because the quilt was made by an artist named Catherine Clark. She had an idea that she wanted to use quilts to represent neighborhoods. And like the previous artworks, this is an abstraction. It represents something that it doesn't depict realistically. Clark based this quilt on data from a map of a neighborhood called Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. But Clark didn't just represent the neighborhood streets with the lines of her quilt. She added something else. What more do you see? You might be wondering about those little red boxes. They actually represent foreclosed houses. Clark made quilts of neighborhoods around the country where communities were having trouble affording their homes. What other community issues might be added to this map? It's called Washington, D.C. Foreclosure Quilt. If you were going to do one around your community, what other issues might you add and what symbols might you use to represent that issue?
So some people are noting the green squares, sort of green space, and adding in parks. And when you look at it overall, you see, a sort of lack of green space, which could also be indicative of certain urban neighborhoods. We could also look at color, line, and pattern. Many people mentioning green space, concrete space, parking lots, homes, parks. So really getting a visual sense of the public and private spaces, inviting people in. Where do you invite people in and where do you keep them out? Someone also mentioning the frayed edges around the quilt. You can see some of the threadbare, threads popping out, and what is that indicative of? Again, that idea of the medium, what's being used here to reinforce the concept that's trying to be communicated.
If you think of that word fraying in the threads, how that word is actually a pun. So I'm leaving this with the idea in mind of something with simple materials that you could use with your students to be able to communicate some very intense, strong ideas and issues. With that in mind, I'm going to go to the next work, which is just a clip from a video interview with the artist, Tiffany Chung. When you're sticking with one community or expanding its context, I want you to consider kickstarting your students' creative process with the following questions. I'm going to provide answers to the questions I'm going to be asking by referencing this artwork. So just listen to the questions and the answers. Which perspectives of an historical event need to be shared to tell a comprehensive story? Tiffany Chung's work that you see here is called Vietnam, Past is Prologue. It documents the large-scale immigration during the post-1975 exodus from Vietnam. Excuse me. Next question. What media would you choose to tell the event's story and engage different styles of learning? Using Tiffany Chung as an example, this map is meticulously stitched with threads, and it's one component in Vietnam Past is Prologue, which is a multimedia work. Think about who and where you would go for data to support the facts of your story. My museum commissioned Chung to conduct video interviews with former Vietnamese refugees who live in Houston, Southern California, and Northern Virginia. Chung made visible a history that's hidden in plain sight for the past 47 years since the war ended. Next question. Who is missing from the story as it's currently being told? Probing the legacies of the Vietnam War and its aftermath, Chung documented accounts that have largely been left out of official histories of the period and begins to tell an alternative story of the war's ideology and effects. In Vietnam, the war devastated life as it had been known. Yet missing from the narratives is the perspective of the South Vietnamese, on whose behalf the Americans entered the war. Chung began with a fine-grained look into one person's story, that of her father who fought for the South Vietnamese military during the war. Then she widened out to encompass the stories of former refugees and pulled out further to show the global effects of their collective migration in the war's wake. Next question. How does that event still impact contemporary life? And I would ask you to think about considering how you can ask your students how current events are influenced by past conflicts. So I wanted to use this piece more as a way to model questions that could help your students work through issues that might be still going on today, as we talked about with the first works from Dubois, with the speeches of the presidents. Now I want to move on to our last artwork for this workshop. Even if you didn't have a chance to watch the video interview of Christo before this workshop, I encourage you to watch it afterwards. Christo shares his passion for this project in a way that I could never emulate. But you may have noticed I didn't tag this workshop because I wanted to ask how you would categorize it. Just based upon what you see and may already know, would you categorize it as a frequency of occurrence, nature-driven, mapping, or all three?
So a couple of folks are saying all three. Actually, several folks are saying all three. One is saying it isn't nature driven because it's drapery. So the form, looking at the form of the artwork, isn't created by nature, although it may be in nature. So someone, just questioning that a little bit. So maybe you can drill down a little bit into that question. Someone else is sharing mapping. Another vote for all three. Someone saying first impression was nature driven, but could justify equally mapping and possibility frequency as well. And then someone else sharing that the nature's form in terms of the landscape is enhanced by the cloth. So even though it's not made, from natural forms, it's following the topography of a natural place.
I love the way everybody's trying to puzzle this out in your minds, and also with what you're writing and sharing in the chat box. You're really looking at this through all those different lenses and trying to figure out exactly then how to be able to interpret this piece. So I'm going to go back to my question format, and I'm going to preface background information on this artwork by first posing questions that are going to help you not only look at this work, but also help you consider if you would define it as art. Is it art because of the uniqueness of the concept? In 1972, Christo and Jean-Claude started with the idea of doing a project that involved the life of Californians related to urban, rural, and ocean areas. Is it art because it measures as an extraordinarily large scale? Called Running Fence, it was 24.5 miles long and 18 feet high. In California, the highway is very important, and the closest highway, they ran 24.5 miles from the coast. If the highway had been 10 miles from the coast, Running Fence would have been only 10 miles long. So the project translates crossing 14 county roads and small roads until crossing the important Route 101 and using the land of 59 ranchers and public space, reflecting how the people in California use the land in these spaces. So you may notice I'm starting to also dig a little bit deeper into the question about, is it nature-driven or not? Is it art because of the data that needed to be captured? On the left is a topographical map outlining one of 3 proposed routes for Running Fence. On the right is a scale model of how a segment of Running Fence would be installed throughout Marin and Sonoma counties. Jean-Claude and Christo scouted 3 possible locations because they were never quite sure of getting permissions for the locations and working out the permit process. Is it art because of the time it took to think through and act upon the creative process? Christo and Jean-Claude spent almost 4 years petitioning ranchers to let them use their pastures, attended 18 public hearings, and drafted an environmental impact report. It was the first time this was done for an artwork. Eventually, the couple won everyone over, even ranchers who had no interest in art. Although I don't know if this man was ever won over. And is it art because it was temporary? The actual fence was only up for 14 days after its completion in September of 1976. Or is it art because of the media that was used and reused? Soil test probes were conducted. You see the documentation of that on the left. Experiments were done with wooden poles, which didn't work, so they switched to using 2,050 steel poles to support 90 miles of steel cable and 240,000 square yards of heavy woven white nylon fabric that was held in the ground with 13,000 earth anchors. When the installation was in its final stages, Christo realized that the duct tape they were using to keep 350,000 hooks attached to the bottom cable came loose when the wind died down. So the crew unexpectedly had to scour around to find enough duct tape for the project. As Christo said, we desperately needed to buy all these poles inexpensively. It was 1975 and the Vietnam War was ending. The US Army had a huge amount of poles in Texas because they used these poles to build the military airports in Vietnam. The material is extremely valuable. After 2 weeks, the landowners were eager to have the poles, the cables, the fabric for a variety of uses. They used the posts for building their own fences and to build cattle guards. And they used the fabric for their barns and the cable. The fabric has an incredible connection to the surf and the water. The fabric is moved by the motion of the water, but also by the wind. And when the wind is blowing behind, it billows like a pillow or balloon. On the other side is the complete negative.
I'm listening to something.
The negative, the
Soon
nylon,
I'm going to have you help me.
the nylon acts as a conductor in translating the light. And this accounts for the incredible visibility of the project. Or is it art because of what the completed work communicated? Let me pose a question for you to think about and answer. Is this fence separating people, or is it linking people together? What do you think? Based on what you just heard about the process it took to create this, is it separating people or is it linking people together?
So some folks are saying both. I see a vote for both. Someone's saying the fence connects people with nature. Someone else sharing it linked people together. A couple of votes for together, bringing people together, but the physically creating bringing people together for work, but physically creating a barrier. Someone else sharing the separating. A couple more votes for linking together through process, social practice, connecting urban and rural areas, building bridges with the community. Let's see, someone else noticing that they're linking people together. Shout out for Jean-Claude and Christo, always about the way they collaborate, and their collaboration is a major statement about art. Someone sharing their connecting ideas, both physically and intellectually, connecting spaces and people, but also intellectually. Someone else sharing potentially both. And now we're all connected by talking about it, which I love, sort of giving new life to this artwork that no longer exists in its physical, form. Someone else sharing, many people put it together, but it looks like a barrier once it's erected. So that, again, that idea of both is sort of connecting people in the process, but maybe separating people in terms of the manifestation. And a question, did the person who created this say why he erected this?
Christo and Jean-Claude, his wife, always were fascinated by the Californian terrain. And they really liked the idea of being able to show the difference in the terrain between rural, urban, and going to the ocean. So they thought long and hard about how to be able to do that. Now, back to that idea about connection and whether it separates or not. Think about that process again of how many people they had to get into agreement in order to be able to create this. And we don't know what kind of ties that created that lasted after it came down 2 weeks later. Let me read you a few quotes. Christo, we wanted the entire length of the fence to run in relation to man-made structures, a house, a farm, a barn, a farmer's fence. The fence wasn't fencing anything except running to the hills, and I would add to the ocean. So would you call it art? In Christo's mind, and this is another quote, every project is a slice of our lives, a particular moment in our lives, and we'll never do it again. This is an absolutely unique image, meaning there will be no other running fence. Unlike other artists, we're not transporting things around the world. This project is entirely designed for that specific landscape. Nobody can buy the work, nobody can own it, and nobody can charge tickets for it. We do not own the projects. They are beyond the ownership of the artist because freedom is the enemy of possession. That's why these projects do not stay. They are absolutely related to artistic and aesthetic freedom. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Bring up my video. And you're welcome to turn your camera on too if you want, but we're still recording. So we're getting near the end of the workshop and I'm leaving you with a lot of questions to ponder. Not only how to categorize an artwork, but also how to define art. But mostly I hope I've given you some examples of how you can connect art to your curriculum, engage your students in critical thinking skills, and design projects that relate to your curriculum and community. Even empower your students to express their voices. You probably also realize by now that what we've been doing is looking at projects that are STEM related, yes, but also across all disciplines. And that's what we love to do with Sam's collection, is be able to show different ways that it can be used to learn about your world, about American history, and be able to express your thoughts about it. So a reminder, if you want to have this PowerPoint, in the notes sections will be included the background information I've shared with you, the questions that I asked, the URLs for the videos that you saw, and any additional information that we just didn't have a chance to get to. And just email me after the workshop. I'll be happy to post that and send it to you. And then as soon as the recording of this is ready, we'll also share that with you.